You could bake a Thanksgiving turkey and the time it takes him to walk across the stage. What is, do you think, as a member of his staff, what do you think is your moral obligation to say, wait a minute, the president can't do the job anymore? I know you're loyal folks. You believe in your president, this president, whichever president. I'm speaking hypothetically. You're loyal. You want to be a good staffer, but you also have a moral obligation. How do you reach that decision, Professor?
Which is to say to the president, because the 25th Amendment also provides that the president can say, I'm unable to exercise the powers and duties of my office.
And suppose the president
That would be extremely difficult, but I think it should be done.
Look, trust me, I can. And it's clear to you that he has neurodegenerative disease and he can't. What do? Do you have a moral obligation as a staff member to go to the American people and say, we've got a problem here, it may cost me my career?
Hello, Patriots. Welcome back to Signal 76, your trusted source for constitutional truth and conservative analysis. Today, we're diving deep into something that should shake every red-blooded American to their core. We're examining Senator John Kennedy's masterful questioning about the 25th Amendment and what it reveals about the absolute crisis of leadership accountability in Washington. This isn't just politics, folks. This is about the very survival of our republic and the sacred duty every American has to defend our Constitution. Before we get started, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now if you believe in constitutional governance and American exceptionalism. Smash that like button to help us fight the algorithm and get this critical message to every patriot across this great nation. And stick around until the very end, because I'm going to reveal something about the 25th Amendment that the mainstream media will never tell you, something that could change how you view presidential succession forever. Your engagement in the comment section helps us build the strongest conservative community on YouTube, so make your voice heard.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to try to separate policy and politics for a second. I know it's hard to do around this place, but I thought Senator Cornyn made a very good point in his opening remarks. I think Senator Schmidt made the same point that the policy here is very important. And I want to ask you your opinion on the policy. Professor, tell me briefly, I know you came to talk about auto pens, but tell me briefly about the 25th Amendment.
Well, Senator, the 25th Amendment provides the process by which to implement a principle that's in the original Constitution, which is when the president's unable to exercise the powers and duties of the presidency, somebody else exercises them, starting with the vice president. The 25th Amendment sets up a process by which, if there's a question whether the president is able to do that, the vice president and the heads of the executive departments can temporarily basically put the vice president in as acting president, and then Congress ultimately decides the question.
Well, the standard, is it not, Professor? The standard is disability of the president. Is that correct?
Unable to exercise the powers and duties.
Okay.
Yes.
Here's what I would like your opinion on, and the opinion of these two gentlemen here. You have all been staffers. You've worked in government. You've had a boss. In Mr. Spicer's case, his boss was the President of the United States. Let's suppose the president, you were using your experience as a staffer. You were working for the president, any president. Hypothetically a president. And let's suppose the president started talking like he was from outer space. Let's suppose the president became fatigued very easily. He couldn't finish a sentence without taking a nap. Let's suppose the president, he was just physically in bad shape, mentally and physically. Mentally, he may or may not have, you're not a doctor, neurodegenerative disease, but physically you can see you could bake a Thanksgiving turkey and the time it takes him to walk across the stage. What is do you think, as a member of his staff, what do you think is your moral obligation to say, wait a minute, the president can't do the job anymore? I know you're loyal folks. You believe in your president, this president, whichever president. I'm speaking hypothetically. You're loyal. You want to be a good staffer, but you also have a moral obligation. How do you reach that decision, Professor? And I'll go to each of you.
Senator, I think the first thing you would have to do in a situation like that is exercise your own judgment. How serious is this problem? Because everybody has moments when they lose focus, it happens. But if somebody thinks this is a really serious problem, I think the first thing to do is the most difficult, which is to say to the president, because the 25th Amendment also provides that the president can say, I'm unable to exercise the powers and duties of my office.
And suppose the president
That would be extremely
says,
difficult, but I think it should be done.
look, trust me, I can. And it's clear to you that he has neurodegenerative disease and he can't. What do? Do you have a moral obligation as a staff member to go to the American people and say, we've got a problem here, it may cost me my career?
Senator, I think at that point you have an obligation to talk to the vice president,
Okay.
who is in charge of the Section 4 process under the 25th Amendment.
What about you, Mr. Wald? You have a moral obligation. I understand you want it to go away, you want to work it out with him, but you can't. When does a staffer have a moral obligation to stand up and say he can't be president anymore, or she can't be?
Well, Senator, the 25th Amendment only works if individual staffers or officers of the United States exercise that kind of moral judgment.
That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think always, as the professor said, I mean, the presidency is an enormous burden, so it would be not one instance, it would have to be several instances of a failure to exercise judgment.
How do you make that decision? You're the staffer, I get it.
Yeah, well, I think it begins with prayer, of course, but after that, I think it's conversation with other staffers, and if you're unable to confront the president or to raise the issue with the vice president, you should resign.
What about you, Mr. Spicer? Do you stand up and do it and tell the truth and run, or do you have a greater obligation to your boss?
Well, luckily, I didn't have that problem. But I would say that you have a moral obligation as an American, as a citizen, as a human being. If the leader of the free world cannot conduct themselves to make the decisions that are critical to this country and to the world, you absolutely have a moral obligation to follow the chain of command. And if they don't act, then you must.
Do either of you gentlemen disagree with that? Professor?
Senator, I think acting means talking to the people who have the responsibility or in a position under the Constitution to do something.
You don't
about the
agree with
situation.
Mr. Spicer?
Senator, I'm not sure exactly what he has in mind, other than talking to the people who can make
I'm
the
just
decision.
trying to ask, you've all been staffers. Suppose you go to everybody you're supposed to go to, and they all say, my advice to you is to shut up. Do you have a moral obligation as a staffer to say, look, this person can't be president of the United States. It isn't policy. He physically can't do it.
Senator Kennedy, it's not a question of whether a staffer has that obligation. It's whether you as an American have that obligation. And I think each and every one of us does.
Yeah, but you can see it. An American can't. Professor, what do you think?
Senator, I think there are situations under which someone in that position should speak publicly, but I also think that the views of a single individual who is not the person who is constitutionally responsible for taking measures should be considered by the public as just the views of of one individual who has some information about the subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
What we witnessed in the Senate hearing is nothing short of extraordinary. Senator John Kennedy, that brilliant constitutional scholar from Louisiana, just exposed the fundamental weakness in our system of government that the establishment desperately wants to keep hidden. While the liberal media focuses on partisan theatrics, Kennedy cut straight to the heart of what every American should be asking. What happens when we have a president who simply cannot fulfill the duties of the office? The 25th Amendment isn't some obscure constitutional footnote that only law professors care about. This is the safety valve our founders never explicitly created, but that became absolutely necessary as our nation grew in power and complexity. When Lyndon Johnson was considering heart surgery, when Ronald Reagan was shot. When questions arose about presidential capacity, this amendment became the guardrail protecting American democracy from chaos and uncertainty. Kennedy's hypothetical scenario wasn't just academic exercise. He painted a picture that should terrify every patriot. A commander-in-chief who talks like he's from outer space, who can't finish a sentence without falling asleep, who takes longer to cross a stage than it takes to cook a Thanksgiving turkey. This isn't about any specific president, despite what the left-wing media will try to tell you. This is about the principle that the American people deserve a leader who can actually lead. The responses from these witnesses reveal everything wrong with Washington's culture of enabling and cover-ups. These are seasoned government professionals, people who've worked at the highest levels of power, and their answers show just how broken the system really is. When push comes to shove, when a nation's security hangs in the balance, too many people in government choose personal loyalty over constitutional duty. Professor's response about encouraging voluntary resignation shows the naive thinking that pervades academic circles. In the real world, when someone is experiencing cognitive decline severe enough to threaten national security, they're often the last person to recognize it or admit it. Expecting voluntary resignation is like expecting a person with dementia to diagnose themselves. It's not going to happen, and every moment we wait puts America at risk. The discussion about moral obligation versus constitutional process reveals the deep tension at the heart of our system. These witnesses talked about prayer, consultation, following chain of command, but Kennedy kept pushing them toward the ultimate question. What do you do when the system fails? What do you do when everyone you're supposed to consult tells you to shut up and stay quiet? This is where conservative principles become absolutely crucial. We believe in the Constitution, we believe in following proper procedures, but we also believe that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. When constitutional processes are being deliberately ignored or subverted, when the people responsible for invoking the 25th Amendment refuse to act, then individual Americans with knowledge of presidential incapacity have a moral duty that transcends their job descriptions. Spicer's response was the most honest and patriotic of the bunch. He clearly stated that as Americans, as citizens, as human beings, we have moral obligations that go beyond loyalty to any individual president. When a leader of the free world cannot conduct themselves properly or make critical decisions, action becomes mandatory. This is conservative governance at its finest. Loyalty to principles over personalities, duty to country over career advancement. The 25th Amendment contains 4 sections, but Section 4 is what Kennedy was really driving at. This section allows the vice president and majority of cabinet members to declare the president unable to discharge presidential duties. It's designed for exactly the scenario Kennedy described, when a president is incapacitated but won't or can't recognize it themselves. Here's what the mainstream media won't tell you about Section 4. It's deliberately difficult to invoke precisely because the founders understood how dangerous it could be in the wrong hands. It requires not just the vice president, but a majority of cabinet members. If the president objects, it requires a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress to sustain the action. These aren't accidental hurdles. They're constitutional safeguards against political coups disguised as medical interventions. But Kennedy's questions expose the flip side of that protection. What happens when those safeguards become barriers to necessary action? What happens when political calculation overrides constitutional duty? What happens when cabinet members and congressional leaders prioritize their own political survival over national security? The witnesses' discussion about speaking publicly reveals another crucial aspect of this debate. In our system of government, information belongs to the American people. When government officials have knowledge that the president is incapacitated, keeping that information secret violates the fundamental principle of democratic accountability. The people have a right to know if their elected leader can actually lead. Conservative governance demands transparency and accountability. We don't believe in government by secrecy, government by expert consensus, or government by bureaucratic convenience. We believe the American people are smart enough and responsible enough to handle the truth about their leaders' capabilities. Treating citizens like children who can't handle difficult truths is exactly the kind of paternalistic thinking that conservatives have always opposed. Kennedy's questioning also highlighted the weakness of relying solely on institutional processes when those institutions are captured by political interests. The 25th Amendment assumes that vice presidents and cabinet members will put constitutional duty above personal ambition. History shows us that assumption isn't always valid. Sometimes the people closest to power have the most to lose from acknowledging that power is being exercised improperly. This brings us to the fundamental conservative principle that individuals must sometimes stand up against institutions when those institutions fail. The witnesses talked about moral obligations, and they were absolutely right. But moral obligations don't disappear just because following them might be inconvenient or career damaging. True patriots understand that some principles are worth sacrificing for. The discussion about consulting with other staffers before taking action makes sense to a point, but it also reveals how groupthink can paralyze necessary action. When everyone in an administration has invested their careers in a particular president's success, expecting them to objectively evaluate that president's capacity creates an obvious conflict of interest. Sometimes the person with the clearest view of presidential incapacity might be the person with the least to lose from speaking truth to power. Kennedy's persistence in pushing these witnesses toward the ultimate question about public disclosure was masterful. He forced them to confront the logical endpoint of their moral reasoning. If you truly believe the president is incapacitated, if you've tried working within the system, if you've been told to shut up and stay quiet, then what's your next move? Do you prioritize your career over your country? Do you prioritize political convenience over constitutional duty? The professor's final answer about individual views being considered as just one person's perspective misses the broader point about democratic accountability. In our system, individuals with relevant knowledge and experience don't speak just for themselves. They speak as part of the broader conversation that democracy requires. Dismissing such voices as merely individual opinions undermines the very foundation of democratic discourse. What makes this entire discussion so relevant today is how it exposes the vulnerabilities in our current system. We have a 25th Amendment that's almost impossible to invoke, a political class that prioritizes loyalty over constitutional duty, and a media establishment that's more interested in protecting preferred politicians than informing the American people about their capabilities. Conservative solutions to this problem start with demanding transparency and accountability from everyone in government. We need cabinet members who understand that their oath is to the Constitution, not to any individual president. We need congressional leaders who will ask hard questions regardless of partisan considerations. We need media outlets that will report on presidential capacity honestly rather than filtering everything through partisan lenses. The moral obligation question that Kennedy kept pushing isn't just about government staffers. Every American citizen has a moral obligation to stay informed about their leaders' capabilities and to demand accountability when those capabilities are in question. This isn't about being disloyal to conservative presidents or giving ammunition to liberal critics. This is about maintaining the constitutional system that protects conservative values in the first place. True patriotism sometimes requires uncomfortable conversations about leadership capacity. True conservatism sometimes requires challenging authority when that authority is being exercised improperly. The founders created a system of checks and balances precisely because they understood that power corrupts and that even well-intentioned leaders can become incapacitated or compromised. Kennedy's questions also reveal how the 25th Amendment interacts with other constitutional provisions about presidential succession. The amendment doesn't create new powers. It creates new processes for implementing powers that already existed. The vice president doesn't become president under Section 4. They become acting president while the actual president remains in office, but unable to exercise presidential duties. This distinction matters because it affects how we think about loyalty and duty during periods of presidential incapacity. Staff members don't owe their primary loyalty to an incapacitated president. They owe their loyalty to the office of the presidency and to the constitutional system that defines that office. When those loyalties conflict, the Constitution must prevail. The witnesses' agreement about moral obligations was encouraging, but their reluctance to fully embrace the implications of those obligations reveals the challenges facing anyone who finds themselves in such a situation. Government service requires balancing multiple loyalties and responsibilities, but the Constitution must remain supreme among those considerations. What Kennedy demonstrated through his questioning is that the 25th Amendment only works if individual Americans are willing to exercise moral courage when institutional processes fail. Constitutional government depends not just on written rules, but on the character of the people who implement those rules. When character fails, the Constitution becomes just words on paper. This is why conservative education about constitutional principles remains so crucial. Americans need to understand not just what the Constitution says, but why it says it and how it's supposed to work in practice. The 25th Amendment isn't just a legal mechanism. It's a reflection of deeper principles about democratic accountability and the limits of executive power. Patriots, what we've analyzed today isn't just about one Senate hearing or one constitutional amendment. This is about the fundamental question of whether our system of government can adapt to challenges the founders never anticipated while maintaining the principles they established. The answer depends on whether individual Americans are willing to uphold their constitutional duties, even when doing so requires personal sacrifice. That's why your engagement with content like this matters so much. Every like, every comment, every share helps spread constitutional awareness to more Americans who need to understand these principles. The establishment wants to keep these conversations limited to academic circles and political insiders, but constitutional government belongs to all of us. Make sure you're subscribed to Signal 76 for more constitutional analysis that cuts through the political noise and focuses on the principles that made America great. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest content, and share this video with every patriot in your network who needs to understand what's really at stake in our constitutional system. The fight for constitutional government never ends. Patriots. It requires constant vigilance, constant education, and constant willingness to stand up for principles, even when doing so isn't easy or convenient. Senator Kennedy showed us what that looks like in practice, and now it's up to all of us to follow his example in our own spheres of influence. Stay strong, stay informed, and keep fighting for the constitutional republic our founders gave us. Until next time, this is Signal 76, defending liberty and constitutional government one video at a time.